Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar. This is Learn About Ground Nesting Bees with Cornell's GNBee project. Just before I get further, I just want to let you guys all know that we will be sharing a link to this recording also on our e-newsletter in June. And you're welcome to share this webinar far and wide. To kick things off, I'll just introduce myself and each other. I'm Laura Ross. I'm the National Coordinator of Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA for the Xerces Society. And Carly, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Carly Hirschman. I'm the Community Engagement Assistant for Xerces, and so I support Laura with the Bee City USA program, and then I also support our Ambassador Outreach program, and I see some of you have joined us today, so thank you so much, affiliates and ambassadors.
Yeah, and we're very pleased today to have a guest presenter, Dr. Jordan Kueneman from Cornell. I'll go ahead and Jordan, let you introduce yourself, and then you can go ahead and share whenever you're ready.
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm joining you all from Ithaca, New York. I work at Cornell in the Brian Danforth lab, and my main focus these days is on ground nesting bees, their biology, their conservation, and their applied management. And so with that, I want to say thank you to everyone for having me here with you today, and thank you for Xerces for hosting this webinar. It's a pleasure to join you, and it's a pleasure to introduce you to Project GNBee. So I'm going to start with the slides. So I wonder if I press share, whether that would be an option here, uh, and whether or not you can see the first slide.
Yes, looks great.
All right. Well, thank you so much. So Project GNBee is a new citizen science initiative and dedicated to the often overlooked but essential group of ground nesting bees. Um, see if I can advance. Yes. So these vital pollinators deserve our attention. And I'm excited to share with you how we're working to better understand them, research them, protect them through conservation efforts, um, and also link their pollination services to an applied management of crops and and other ecosystem functions. So a little bit of a roadmap for our talk today. In this outline, we have four sections. We'll just go through a background on bees. We'll spend most of our time in the research section and teaching you all how to make observations that you might contribute to the project. A little bit about what we're doing with that information. We'll talk briefly about how these efforts lead to conservation of ground nesting bees and what we can do with regard to applied management after learning about these bees and their nesting requirements. So first, the background. Uh, Starting off is that bees are far more diverse than most people realize. There's 20,000 species of described bees. This is more than amphibians or reptiles, birds or mammals, and on par with the most abundant vertebrates, these fishes. So incredible diversity of bees and really something to behold. Bees have diverse life history strategies. Most people don't realize that the majority of bees are solitary, meaning they don't have a hive, rather, they provide resources individually for the next generation. And 77% of all bee species that we've described are solitary. A further 13% are parasites. They're bees that are parasites of other bees. There is only 9% of the bee diversity that's social. So you think honeybees, bumblebees, stingless bees in particular. And then the most rare life history strategy are these social parasites. But when you add up solitary bees and their bee parasites, this accounts for 90% of all bee diversity. So the majority of bees are solitary. We know that these bees are essential pollinators in both natural ecosystems and agricultural systems, but it shouldn't be lost on us that bees pollinate over 85% of all flowering plant species. Obviously, ants and beetles and flies also contribute to pollination, but bees are excellent pollinators of diverse plants. Bees pollinate 75% of global food crop species. This is very important to us if we want to maintain diverse diets. And these bees enhance the ecosystems both through their productivity by increasing seed set, but also through stability of ecosystems because they themselves become prey for other animals. So pollination of these crops that we mentioned requires numerous pollinator species. So in a study done by Winfrey et al. In 2018, they looked at the number of species required to reach various levels of pollination in different crops, watermelon, cranberry, and blueberry. And they found that for watermelon, you needed almost 50 species of bees to reach 75% pollination rate. For cranberry, that was almost 40 species of bees. And for blueberry, 20 species of bees. So when they combine all that together across these various sites, because a lot of these bees can visit multiple crops, that number reached almost 80 species of bees required to get a level of 75% pollination. So we really need these diverse bee communities in order to field the pollination services that we need in the environment. In a study that was complementary, this Riley et al. 2020 looked at pollen limitation for different crops. So pollen limitation is saying that the plant could receive more pollinators. There are flowers that are left unpollinated. And so apple, cherry, and blueberry had the highest rates of pollen limitation. And their study and their work really showed that if we lose bee diversity or even bee richness and numbers of bees, that we will have less and less of these crops that are highly nutritious and valuable. And this is really important to keep in mind as we think about bees because the evidence suggests that bees are in decline globally. In a study conducted by Zatara and Eisen in 2021, they show that the current records for bees are actually increasing through time. So more and more people are reporting bee observations, but the number of species that they're reporting is going down. When they look at that bee species richness, bend by decade, you see that you need fewer observations to reach the bees in that environment. And that's all suggesting that bee species and bee species richness is declining. And so that's a concern of ours. Moving on to maybe the best data sets available that are found in Britain. They have conducted long-term studies of their insect diversity in ways that aren't done in other places. But they did a study, Pawnee et al. In 2019, was looking at pollinated insects in Britain and found a very large decrease in hoverflies and their occupancy as well as bees. Um, Host plant specialists and species with one generation per year were the most at risk. And for solitary bees, they found that 32% decline. So that's another concern. The native bee declines are driven largely by human activities, and these are the same culprits that we see in a lot of systems. But we should mention that habitat loss and fragmentation are particularly detrimental to bees, as well as pesticide exposure, particularly from neonicotinoids that have long half-lives in the environment. Invasive species, including non-native bees, such as honeybees in the U.S., can compete with bees, native bees for resources. And then pathogens and parasites are known to be important and have negative effects on bees, but they're difficult to assess for solitary bees in ways that we can discuss and will later in this talk. In a more recent study conducted by Guzman et al. In 2023, looking at pesticide use by county across the US, their conclusion here was that the most vulnerable species are solitary and ground nesting. Indeed, every genus of ground nesting bees had a significant negative effect with regard to pesticide use. So these were reduced in their abundance in the environment. And not only were the solitary ground nesting bees hit by these pesticides, but also their brood parasites, so the diversity that goes along with them. And this is concerning because we know that ground nesting is the ancestral strategy for bees, but it's also the most common strategy for bees. Indeed, somewhere between 65 and 80%, depending upon where you're looking, of species are thought to be ground nesting. So these bees dig burrows in the soil where they build their brood cells and provision them with pollen and nectar. Showing you here a fantastic photo of Oxea flavescens, which produces a very deep nest, up to 2 meters deep. And this nest architecture is fairly typical, where you have a central tumulus going all the way down, and then these lateral dug areas off to the sides that then have individual brood cell chambers coming off of them. I've studied a number of bees and their nesting biology underground. And so I get to observe some of this firsthand and the diversity of strategies firsthand. But these bees spend most of their life underground. And that can limit the opportunities for their observation. And so that's why it's really important when we do observe them to make note of this. And so for most bees, you can think of them as solitary, ground nesting, and largely living underground. In a really fantastic review by Antonin and Forrest in 2021, they put forth that studies of ground nesting bees are really scarce relative to the number of species in this group. So we don't really know much about what they're doing for most species. We don't know often their life history, whether they are um, social, facultatively social, communal, solitary. Their life cycles are largely unknown, how long they develop underground. Their nest architecture is often unknown. Sometimes they're very elaborate, sometimes they're relatively straightforward. Um, Nest site selection, which characteristics matter, is also unknown for ground nesting bees. So abiotic factors such as the soil texture, soil compaction, soil moisture, temperature are thought to be important, but we don't know the specifics. Biotic factors like surface features or presence of conspecifics, floral and nesting resources are thought to be important, but generally speaking, we don't know the specifics for most bee species. And even the methods for studying these various the nesting habitats vary. So if you are studying an individual nest, there are certain techniques that you can use. And this is all fascinating, but really need a strategy and you need teamwork if you're going to study bee nesting biology at scale. And that's what we're focused on here today. And so I wanted to share with you a little clip here of a nesting aggregation that I found last year. These are an Andrenid bee that really have taken a liking to this particular patch of soil and grass. What's great about these bees is that they will nest in the same location year after year after year, and it gives us an opportunity to discover them, but then also follow up and learn about them. So that covers the background of this work. And so next we'll focus on some of the research goals and objectives, in particular, how you can make observations that will support this work. So the principal research objectives are very broad. It's why do bees nest where they do? So we talked about how nest site selection depends on biotic and abiotic factors, and that those are poorly understood for most species. We also want to know what allows them to succeed long term. And studying ground nesting bee aggregations through time is really the only way to understand their population stability. And community science is really the only way to address either of these questions. And so, as we proceed, we're hoping that work that the community does to make these observations will allow us to fill in these different puzzle pieces and allow us to understand the biology of the bees above ground, but also below ground. The bulk of this work, or at least the nucleus of this work, is hosted on an iNaturalist project. This is Project Ground Nesting Bees. You can use this QR code to navigate to the iNaturalist page, and I hope that you do. Um, but iNaturalist is a great platform for making observations at scale, and then allows uh, you to upload them and for us to review them in real time. When you find the project, this is what the project banner looks like. So that's how you know you got to the right spot. And it tells you what to look for. So you're looking for bees nesting in aggregations. You can monitor their activity in the spring and through all the way through the summer. And their activity in the entrances where they're coming out of the ground are generally in grass or in soil, or under leaves. But that's where we typically observe them. So you might observe them in other environments as well. And so we want to make sure that you record that when you do. On the project, there's the Hall of Fame. So it gives you the number of observations that have been made, the number of species that have been observed, and the number of people that have made observations. And some of these members, the high-ranking members in terms have made many observations or observed quite a lot of different species. But we'll hope to see your name on there someday. Um, but we need to make a special acknowledgement to all the identifiers on iNaturalist that make this possible. So when you upload your photos, there's a whole community of people that have expertise in taxonomy and expertise in bee biology that can help to identify the bees that you're observing. The map is one of the most important features on the project. I use it all the time. Typically, we'll click onto this map and go to satellite because I like to see things in satellite mode. But it's a way for you to navigate to where you are and see what kind of aggregations have been reported in your area and learn about the bee biology that you can observe close to home. We also encourage you to join and become a member of the project. And this is because we typically will want to reach out and learn more. Observations are kind of a starting point for us. And so we want to ask questions and learn more about the things that you're seeing. Um, as, and so having you as a member allows us to see who's really engaged in the project. So I'll go through how one of these observations really led to an astonishing discovery. An observation of Andrena regularis was made close to Cornell in 2023. This site or this observation came from a cemetery, which was pretty cool, and it's only a kilometer away from my office building at Comstock. And so a lot of us have visited this site and routinely visit this site to learn more and more about the bee biology. But anecdotally, these bees may have been nesting in this cemetery for over 120 years. And we think cemeteries, especially old cemeteries, could be excellent refuge for ground nesting bees. I'll share with you a little look at what that aggregation looks like. So indeed, you can see thousands of bees flying around in and out of focus, which is cool. But sometimes these slow motion videos are wonderful to accompany your observations, or you can share them with us because it really gives us a sense of what we're looking at. We studied this population in great detail, and one of the first things we did was set out emergence traps in the aggregation in order to get an idea of how many bees were emerging from this site and also who was emerging with the bees. So some traps that were meter by meter returned 0 bees, but other ones up to 2,000. And when we mapped the area of the aggregation and multiplied it by the density of the aggregation, our current estimate is that 5.5 million bees emerge each year. And this was a real eye opener, at least for me, that aggregations could be this large. But it turns out, and we're likely to find aggregations that are much bigger. So I know of several that have been reported that are very dense and larger in their area that they occupy. So we're excited to learn more about those as well as any aggregations that you may find. Previous work in the local apple orchard in the Danforth lab showed that Andrena regularis was the dominant pollinator at the local orchard. And so it wasn't till a decade later that we found out where they were coming from. So that's pretty exciting. And it's just goes to show that these bees, their nesting biology is often timed with certain flowering events, some of which happen to be high value commodity crops like apples. And so we really wanted to make the apple orchard managers aware of the nesting bees and the nesting bee cemetery managers aware of the value to the apple orchard. And so there's sort of a connection that can occur and they can support each other. We also learned that Andrena regularis is parasitized by Nomada imbricata, a really amazing parasitic bee. And these parasitic bees do various things, but one of which is lay eggs into the pollen provisions of the host bee, which has done all the hard work. And when those larvae of the parasites hatch, they often cannibalize the host bee, decapitate it, or eat the pollen provisions. But essentially, they take advantage of that hard work and they will emerge the next year. And these relationships between host bees and their parasites are fascinating. And sometimes we'll see tons of parasites and not very many host bees, or the other way around. So we want to learn more about that biology as well. So the aim is to understand these bee nesting and at scale. So we can consider studying bees at local scales, regional scales, and national scales. And each one of these efforts definitely involves a large community effort. For Andrena regularis, the regular mining bee, I'm working on characterizing the nesting biology across the different sites that we have in the project so far. And one way to do that is to utilize the latitude and longitude of the observations to gain information about the nesting site. So I can use databases such as the Soil Survey Geographic Database to get estimates on soil texture, soil pH, other variables associated with soil. The Chelsea Climate Database will give me values associated with the site in terms of rainfall and mean temperature, and a number of other categories. Landfire can provide information on the slope and the aspect and certain conditions of the land. And the USDA crop data layer can provide pretty high resolution layers of the crops that are surrounding those aggregation sites. And all these databases are, available at 30-meter resolution. So it can begin to provide a framework for figuring out what are the nesting requirements of these bees, but and with that information, we can do comparisons on these different categories of these variables, or um, you know, run regressions on some of these variables to see how they're related, and look at where bee species or genera show up on a sort of soil texture triangle, for example. But all of this work is leading towards integrating this different data to model the nesting environments for bee species. What might be considered a poor nesting environment, or a really good nesting environment. And to do this, we really need numerous observations across space through time for bee species. So it does take a lot of observations and a lot of work from the community. And so that's what this talks about, and that's what this project's about, is really getting people involved. And so again, I want to encourage you to open the iNaturalist page and consider visiting your local aggregations to provide observational data and photos from those sites so we can learn more about them. And also to find new aggregations. I mean, if you once you get a search image and you're out biking or hiking or gardening, you'll come across bees nesting in the ground. So take the time to make an observation, and hopefully you or somebody else can follow up and observe it in greater detail. If you are joining this project, you're trying to make an observation, but you don't have the QR code directly in front of you, an easy way to access it is from the website that created gnbee.org. And you'll find these little icons partly down the page that can navigate you to the iNaturalist platform. And if you're new to iNaturalist, you can look at the protocol to join the project and how to upload observations both from your computer and from your phone. So a little bit more information on how to best use this resource is you can click on observations over here and explore those observations at your leisure. It, by clicking on observations, it takes you to this map, but it also allows you to see the filter parameters that are there. And from there, I often use the bee genus or species that I'm interested in, or the state that I'm wanting to look at. And so it's a way to kind of filter the observations down to something that's most relevant to you. And say you were in Portland and inner city, this park is full of bees flying around, one of the largest and densest aggregations that I know of. So you might be able to go visit that site and enjoy, that experience. It's quite mesmerizing. But also, I needed to mention maybe earlier that these bees are gentle. So because they don't have a hive, they're non-aggressive. And so you can just be amongst them and observe them at really close range and get fantastic photos. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of guide you into how to make a top rate observation. So we started this work by asking people to make observations, and little by little, we've been asking for more along the way. And so it makes sense to kind of go through an observation, say, that is really quite excellent, and point out some of the things that make it so helpful. So this is just a random observation that happened on May 1st. So as I was preparing for this talk, I just found one that I thought was quite good, that was recent. And so the first thing that I want to mention is when you upload your observation is to pay attention to the location accuracy. So because we use this remote sensing, the GIS data layers in order to estimate characteristics of these sites, it's really important that those sites have high accuracy, at least within a few meters. It's very helpful. But if the aggregation is on your private property, or if this is a sensitive species, you can obscure the exact location to the public. And so that's a way to help protect those sites if need be. Photo documentation. Here's one of the big ones here. We get a lot of information from the photos you provide. So the first is to take a nesting photo of the nesting, a photo of the nesting area. That gives us some context for what we're looking at. You know, is this a road? Is this a field? You know, what's going on? The next is maybe a little bit closer up, showing some of the nesting activity. Gives us a sense of how densely these bees are nesting, and that you're indeed observing multiple bees. And then if you have bees entering or exiting their tunnels, that's really quite helpful. Um, Photos don't have to be taken within these little glass chambers. You can take photos just naturally as well, because sometimes the bees are just kind of walking around on the ground. Um, or you can even, collect them and take photos as well. But certain attributes that are helpful are the head shape, or the fova, which is these hairs next to the eyes, these pits that are here next to the eyes. The wing veins are helpful for identifying bees, as well as a photo that includes the abdomen and the approximate bee size. So bee identification is quite difficult sometimes, but with these characteristics, you can at least pretty quickly get to the bee genus. And if it's something that we want to explore further with a pin specimen or looking under a microscope, we can help get those identifications down to species or within one or two that we think it might be. So next is to count the nest entrances. So this person, in their notes, it said revisiting an aggregation from last year for ground nesting bee project, moderate activity counted 110 nests. So that's very helpful. It gives us a framework for what we're doing. It also provides a response variable so we can start to figure out which sites are really robust sites for these bees. And that may be indicative as to whether the nesting site is really ideal for their biology. Descriptions of the sites are very handy. So the observer here um, says that photos 11 and 12 show the aggregation, which is on the shoulder of a dirt road facing west-southwest and just downslope from the summit of a small rise in the road, but adjacent terrain slopes down to the road. And some nests are below the alders and others have no overhead cover. So that's really helpful as well. We love to know whether there is overhead cover or not. That also could be captured with a photo. And whether the site is sloped and which direction it's sloped. One way to do that is you can actually measure the slope. So most phones, or at least the iPhones, and I imagine most phones have a measure app that allows you to just set your phone on the ground and figure out what the slope is. That's quite helpful. You can also get a real estimate of the aspect by using the compass app on your phone. So putting the phone in the exact same spot, you can then align it to the main direction of the slope. Um, so that's kind of helpful as well. And I just wanted to point out, yeah, that this is just an excellent, excellent observation. And so here's some guidelines to help you when you're observing bees and bee aggregations to provide as much information as possible. But I want to encourage you to take your time, observing these aggregations. Indeed, they're really fun to watch, as I keep mentioning. And as you observe them, you learn new things about the bees, and you kind of become familiar with the bees' demeanors and their activities and what they might be doing. And I feel like whenever I spend more time at a bee aggregation, I recognize them more quickly, and I'm able to determine, if there's other bees nesting with them that look similar. But I just think it's a fascinating and fun way to spend a little bit of your time. You can estimate the area of the aggregation. So one way to do that is by using the Google Earth. Uh, Either online or on the app, but there's a measure tool. So if the aggregation is quite large and you were to sort of walk around it and figure out the parameters, you could um, use this tool to get an area estimate, or you could, guesstimate, which is also acceptable, but let us know how you got to that number. Again, I mentioned the Google Earth app on your phone will allow you to do the same thing. So if you're in a place that has internet, you could actually just kind of walk around and map it. So that's very helpful. You can also estimate the density of the aggregation. And one way to do that is by using like a very simple measuring device. So I use like a little meter by meter rope and just set it out in the aggregation and count the number of nest entrances I see. If you do this a couple times across the aggregation, you can then get an estimate. So maybe space these out, 3 to 5 meters, and maybe repeat the process, 3 to 6 times, depending upon if you're how willing you are to do it and what you would see. But if you average those density estimates and multiply them by the area, then we can get an estimate of the number of bees in the aggregation. And this is a very useful tool. Again, I mentioned when we're trying to figure out, the basically the health of that aggregation, but also how well they're doing at that site, and does that have anything to do with the attributes of that site? Um, I also would like to point out and encourage people to determine the internesting. So sometimes you think there's only one bee, but really there's several bees. So one site that was studied at Washington College, the folks there were able to even document the sort of spatial distribution of nesting of different species within that site. So they in the site had 3 different bee species that were common, as well as bee parasites, I'm sure. Um, but they were partitioned in the area, and that's really quite fascinating. That so, and generally speaking, they like this area, but they're maybe honing in on different attributes of the site, or maybe certain species are pushed to the less desirable parts of the site. None of this is known, so it's really cool and definitely worthwhile if you are, learning about your bee aggregations to take a moment to consider that they might be multiple bees nesting adjacent to each other in the same area. And again, to mention that the bees often have their bee parasites, and those relationships are generally not known and super interesting, and they're definitely not known across space. So, how often do you see the same host with the same parasite um, across, a large geographic space? We don't know. So this type of information would be very helpful, and that can be done with photographs. If you are, as you go and you are taking your observations to the next level, any notes on floral visitations are welcome. So, which bees are visiting which flowers is this information is largely missing for a lot of species, and so it's very helpful, and certainly it's not known across space. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with a bit of that in the work that you're doing, but as it relates to bee aggregation, we certainly would love those notes as well. And while you're making these observations, be aware that you're likely to, come across new discoveries. So just this week, I got an observation that came in by Christith 7, and it said, very interesting. I observed communal nesting while studying Habropoda habitat today. So this is Habropoda miserabilis. And so she observed 11 females using one entrance in the dune and asked if this was normal. And we spent some time trying to look through the records and species description, nesting biology descriptions, and didn't find any mention of communal nesting in the genus. So, there's so little known about these bees. And so it's really wonderful to learn from you guys. And that's done through these great observations and the notes that are taken. And so once you make observations of a site and we get a sense of what the biology is of that site, we may decide to explore that site together further together. And so there are ways that we can collect bees and study things like pollen use, collect soil to study soil attributes, or even deploy emergence traps to look at things like demographics or the combination of the two to assess health risks for the aggregation. So these are ways that sort of move us towards conservation and allows us to learn even more about the bees in those nesting sites. So there covers the background and some of the research objectives. And so we'll dive in, and these are fairly brief, but just the work that we're trying to do to connect this to conservation. And this has so far largely been done through education and engagement. We have this flyer that we've been sending out to get people to learn about the project. So if you are willing to share this flyer, please let us know. We also, and this other one that gives people idea of what to look for. But we're reaching out to student groups and environmental agencies and people that are doing their Master Gardener, Master Natural programs as well as folks such as yourselves. And so one way to get move us towards conservation of aggregation sites is to get people engaged with them and take an interest in them. So that's very important. And a good example of this also comes from this Washington College. I just keep using this example because it's so wonderful. But these folks reached out because they learned about the project, and there was a lot of discussion going on how to get rid of the bees, and because they were an eyesore during graduation times or something. And so we, got involved with them and encouraged them to study their bees and teach the students about the bee diversity in biology as a means to help protect them and allow them to persist in their nesting sites. So that's one important strategy. Another strategy came from this really cool aggregation site or anecdote and example. This is from Bern, New York, where the homeowners were perplexed as to what was going on in their yard. This is their backyard, and they had, around 600,000 nesting Melisodes bees, and they were concerned about whether or not they were a problem or what to do about them. But we have spoken with them and do now routinely and encourage them to keep their bees around because they're very valuable in the environment um, that they're living in, and they have sort of taken them on as their friends now, and so we see this as a good strategy is getting people excited about the diversity that they have rather than fear it. Um, and through advocacy, just like that, there's another nesting aggregation that where a extermination van had rolled up next to it, and folks reached out, and so we had conversations with the community in that area about the value of the bees and that they should ideally keep them around and not get rid of them. And so hopefully that went well. So connecting people to bees, much in the way that you in this community is through Bee Campus and Bee City and the Xerces group, getting people to connect to the bees across space and also through time is something that we're keen to do with these aggregation sites. And so a lot of this effort and work that I hope to do with this community and with our other community science members is to help establish these research sites and these conservation sites and get people to vouch for them and stand up for them. So lastly, we'll just touch base with what can be done for applied management. And this is a new direction that builds off of the information that we're learning about bees and why they nest where they do. I would point out that there's only one species of ground nesting bee that's managed for agricultural purposes. This is the alkali bee, Nomia melanderi. So it's intensively managed for alfalfa pollination. And so, this sort of leads you to this path. Well, can we learn more about bees or figure out the nesting requirements of bees for other cropping systems, and then provide opportunities to move us away from dependence on single honeybee species. And so some of these observations that we're getting and making are really quite unique because they're nesting in man-made habitats. So here was a baseball diamond that had a conditioner put on it, but this relatively rare Andrena erythroniae and trout lily bee loved this location. And so that's really quite remarkable. So we're learning a little bit about certain substrates that bees may really enjoy and take advantage of. Another example is the sandbox at this park. So there was actually two species of bees, Cletids nesting in this sand. So these are just little anecdotes and examples, but they allow us to start to collect samples from different aggregations and learn what are these characteristics. Is it something about the soil that really matters, or is it something else that really matters? But we are collecting soil samples from certain aggregations to learn about basically what are the parameters that bees may be honing in on. And the goal is to, connect this actual site data to these nesting requirements of bees. Some of this work is being tested in apple orchards here in New York. So I've put some of these soil substrates that match to the nesting aggregations locally near and in apple orchards. And we're monitoring nesting occurring at those sites now. And so the hope is that we can figure out ways to encourage bees to nest in areas that we want them. And so that really covers, the introductory work on applied management that we're doing. But looking forward, the idea is to, bring together all these different aspects, modeling bee nesting requirements and screening for pesticides and looking at how to integrate pollination with orchards and photography and species identification, soil sampling. So all these different elements we're looking at bringing together. And what holds this together is really this community science effort. It's all of you guys that can provide details about what you're seeing in your environment and allow us to kind of piece that together into a cohesive understanding about ground nesting bee biology. And so with that, I have to say thank you to a lot of different folks. It's all possible thanks to the our team in the Danforth lab, as well as some members outside the lab that contribute substantially. So a special thanks to a large number of folks here, our financial supporters, mainly the Cornell's Atkinson Center for Sustainability, as well as the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. And thank you to all of you for joining me here today and learning about this project. And thank you for all the wonderful photos that our community has shared with us over the last 2 years. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We have tons of questions for you in the chat.
Okay, well,
Um,
good.
yeah, lots of great questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for your thoughtful ideas and questions. And I'm gonna pass it over to Carly to take the lead on reading those out loud for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. Thank you so much, Jordan. I especially love the little video clips you have of the aggregations. Those look so amazing to see up close. So thank you for sharing.
They do,
Um,
yeah. I do encourage people to make their own, and please share them if you do.
Oh, and before we get started, I just wanted to put in the chat, if you're interested in learning more about Washington College's nest aggregations, I actually did a video with them for the Maryland Natural History Society. So,
Wonderful.
23 minutes into the YouTube video I just shared in the chat is the start of the spiel on and beautiful photos of their nesting aggregations at Washington College, which is the bee campus.
Yeah, they've been so wonderful to work with, but that type of work is going on and now in multiple places, and so we're very excited to work with anyone who wants to learn more about their local aggregations.
all right. Well, we do have a lot of questions coming. We're going to try to get to all of them. We're going to go about a half hour of questions here. So if there's similar ones, I will combine them. Jordan, you shared a flyer and we're asking if folks were interested in getting that out. And a lot of folks said they are interested in getting that flyer out for you.
Yeah.
Who do they contact about getting that flyer? How do they get that from you?
Yeah, so I think I sh also shared it with you guys. So that might be the fastest way for it to reach your
Okay.
community. Um, Or it is like pinned at the top of the Instagram. So if you share the Instagram link, I just leave that at the top. Um, and so that's a great way to share it as well. Or there is worst case scenario, our email is groundnestingbees@gmail.com, which is also shared in this talk. And so you could always email and request those materials and we'd gladly share with you probably more and other materials as well. So
All right. I did just see a couple questions in the chat pop up about if this is uh, will be shared because they joined late. Yes, we are going to be sharing this on our YouTube channel. I'll post the link in the chat and that'll be up in a few days. So let's dive into some ground nesting bee questions. Jennifer Kondo would like to know, how deep do ground nesting bee cavities go? I'm sure it depends on species. Is there a variation between species?
yes, absolutely. So, well, the deepest ones that I know about are actually from these social ground nesting bees, which looks like they go down about 12 feet. And I've worked on ground nesting bees that have provisioned for their young at around 6 feet deep. Even that photo was me nearly standing in that hole and dug my own grave to study that bee. Um, but you know, It varies depending upon the species. So anywhere from a few inches to a few feet is pretty normal. I'd say typically it's around 16 inches.
Great, thank you so much. And a few folks, I know that you touched on how to make a great iNaturalist submission.
Mhm.
Some folks are wondering, is there somebody that reviews those? If they're not sure if it's a ground nesting bee, if they're not an expert, should they still participate? Um,
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, you can make the observation and include us, and we will get it and review it. If you're like don't know at all whether it's a bee, if you just post the observation to iNaturalist, people will also let you know whether what you're looking at, whether it's a bee or a wasp or something totally different. Um, but yeah, you're welcome to share that with us.
Great, thank you. And Colleen is wondering, do solitary bees sometimes have aggregations like this, or would that automatically mean they're not solitary if they were aggregated?
No, so yeah, some bees nest entirely on their own, right? But they're very hard to find. You're not very likely to find them. If you do find them, please make an observation as well. Um, but what we're sort of starting with in this project, and just somewhat by default, but also because it's very fascinating, are where we get these very large aggregations, or where we see bees communally nesting, and those are easier to observe because there's many of them. You can often find one either coming and going, whereas if it's a single bee, you might be waiting a long time to figure out whether it's going to leave its nest again or whether it's going to return, and when it does. So yeah, so they are solitary. They just have basically, through whatever mechanisms that we're trying to figure out, decided that it's in their best interest to nest uh, close to where they were, typically as close to where they were born, but nest together. And so there's cool hypotheses there about whether they're, if they're in the center of the aggregation, whether they're less likely to be predated upon or whether less likely to be parasitized. And sometimes they'll even change their behavior or their nest entrances depending upon where they're nesting in an aggregation. So there's just all these cool things you can learn about the bees. Um, so yes, the bees are solitary, but they sometimes will nest, depending upon the species, will nest in the same area together.
And along that same vein, do you ever find more than one species nesting within an aggregation?
Yes, uh-huh. So in the cemetery site, we had four different species that were nesting together and two bee parasites that we found. It's possible that we would even find more. And in, the site in Washington College, they had three different host bee species that they've identified, as well as different bee parasites. So this happens very frequently.
Great, thank you so much. And since we're on the topic of the bee parasites, are the bee parasites always parasitic to other bees?
Yes, so these bee parasites have very specialized relationships with their bees, with their host bees, and we also don't know the fine point details there. So we don't know if sometimes they'll be parasites of other bee species. Um, but yeah, these are co-evolved relationships that we're observing.
That makes sense. Thank you so much, Jordan. If ground nesting bees use the same nesting site year after year, what happens to these bees when their habitat is destroyed? Do they try to find a nesting site near their old site?
Excellent question. So, not all species will nest in the same site year after year, and there's always variability because of the number of different species. They're all kind of doing things slightly different from one another. Some bees will use the same location for multiple years and then all move. Some bees will move year after year, but a lot of species that we're working with utilize the same site year after year, decade after decade, and we don't know the upper limits there. So. I mentioned that, anecdotally, we think these bees may be nesting in this site for over 120 years since it was first put in. But we're trying to learn about that as well.
Great. Thank you so much for that information. In places where there's a lot of annual rain and possibly flooding, how do bees protect themselves and their larvae from water?
Interesting. I guess to the previous question's point, they asked about what would happen if their site was destroyed, and so that is an unknown as to whether or not they really will tolerate um, a place adjacent to where they were nesting. I mean, if they would use it, why aren't they currently using it? And so those are some of the questions that I have is why do we see these really strict boundaries where you have lots of bees nesting in one site, but then just adjacent to it, there's no bees nesting? What's really changed? And so those are some of the questions that we're pursuing. Now, with respect to flooded areas, it's pretty fascinating. So bees, tolerate this differently. So some bees actually can tolerate full flooding, which is quite fascinating. And sometimes these are bees that have these like cellophane bags that really protect their provisions underground. So they're watertight. Whereas bees that don't do that, they can't survive those events. But which is why and one reason we think we see bees often nesting on sloped surfaces or at the tops near the top of sloped surfaces, so that they don't have to survive through these inundations of water.
Great. Thank you so much, Jordan. How far from the ground nest do these bees forage?
That's a very good question. It has a lot to do with the species again, and it has also to do with the size of the bee. So, larger bees can forage farther distances than the smaller bees.
Mhm.
But I generally, I think of it as around a kilometer as being sort of a reasonable distance to travel for a bee. But they can travel farther than that.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like a lot of these questions that's very species dependent, and there's a lot that you don't know. So it's great that you're doing this
Yeah, I
research.
mean, that was one of the main points of this talk is that actually we don't know very much. Where we're trying to learn this and we're going to try to learn this all together.
And a few different folks had asked about the flat-sided glass vials that you had in your presentation. Is there a size that's recommended or a good source that you know of for them?
I didn't expect that question, and I'm not sure. So I
Okay.
didn't make that observation. I just happened to see it, and because yeah, because it was in those files, the photos were quite easy to get. It was easier to get numerous photos that were very helpful. Whereas sometimes it's tricky when you're hovering around a bee and moving around it trying to get the right angle. It can take
Mhm.
off on you. So unfortunately, no, but I will look into that. That is a great question.
Thank you, Jordan. Yeah, that was a curveball I threw at you, but I'm going to go back to the bees specifically. So, do the bees that emerge in the spring lay eggs the same season? What is the time difference between emergence and new nest digging? And how can you tell if a hole is from an emergence versus a new egg laying event?
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. So most of the bees, that we're talking about, so they basically the males will emerge first. They'll wait for the females to emerge and mate with them, and then the males die. The females will go around provisioning. They'll start well, first they'll start their main tunnel entrance, right? And then they'll go and create these laterals one by one and go off and collect pollen and nectar, create this pollen mass and lay an egg on it and close it up. So they're doing that one after the other until they basically wear out. And that can, typically take somewhere between weeks to, 2 months. And and so those bees will develop underground. But each bee develops will not they won't emerge that season because they're waiting until the conditions are right the next year so that they can follow the same path that their parents took, right? So they're not going to emerge until at least 1 year. But some species will wait out bad weather events, wait for good rain conditions and can be underground for as long as 5 years that we know of. So each bee again does it differently, but it's really fascinating to learn about how they do it.
Uh, just a heads up, we're at the top of the hour, but we're going to keep answering questions for another about 20 minutes. But if you need to jump off, this is recorded and will be posted on YouTube. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions and your interest in this project. Stay tuned for our June e-newsletter, Bee City e-newsletter to see this recording, and I'll also link to the flyer and hopefully a couple extra links too to help out. And hopefully we'll do a blog post as well. But thank you so much if you need to hop off. Otherwise, stay on and we'll keep answering questions.
Thanks for the reminders, Laura. Yeah, we're going to keep going for another 10 or 15-ish minutes. Lots of great questions coming in. I'm going to switch a little bit to the project itself versus bee questions. So what is the time frame for the ground nesting bee project?
Yeah, well, my hope is that I can continue it long term, right? So that's the goal, is to basically create this platform so we can learn. It'll take a while to accomplish our goals. So the idea is to keep it going year after year, and so that we can basically grow this endeavor and learn more about bees every year.
Great. And someone's wondering, they say they entered data for Bumblebee Watch and they have a portal to enter Bumblebee's nest data. Should they enter Bumblebee nest data also into gnbee.org, or do you get that data from Bumblebee Watch?
Interesting. So bumblebees, a lot of them will nest in the ground, but um, they sort of fall a little bit outside of what the scope is for this project, in that they don't often use the same location year after year, and they're modifying their environment, so they're not dependent upon the soil or conditions explicitly in order for that to be a good nest site. So this project doesn't really utilize bumblebee data.
That's a good distinction to make. Thank you so much. I do want to touch on creating habitat for ground nesting bees and the use of mulch or arborist chips. We've had a few folks asking about that. What kind of scale is good for the ground best nesting bees habitat? And do you have any specific recommendations um, on creating habitat for them?
Yeah, well, not yet. So we really need to characterize which bees are using which nesting resources first. And so we're working on that right now. With respect to mulch, I mean, bees do tend to like exposed areas. They seem to utilize those. Um, but I don't know the degree that really care about mulch. Um, but again, open-ended questions for different species of bees. And if you are doing that type of work and discover bees utilizing that resource, please share those observations.
Great. Thank you so much. And then I had a couple questions about identifying nests, what to look for to find them, because some folks have not been able to find them, and if they can attract the bees to a site by pre-drilling some holes.
Yeah, so no, I don't think the bees will use pre-drilled holes in the ground. They would do that, if it was in wood, but those are a different group of bees. Um, and we don't know about how to attract them to the site yet. We don't know whether they're queuing in on certain pheromones of bees. Um, but it seems like if you have, if the spot is works for them, that they will find it on their own. So so that's the first thing, is that, getting bees to nest in a certain site is tricky, and I am working on that, and I will let you know what I find. But it does take some time to get bees to even find what you've provided for them. And then the other part of that question was, can you tell me again? There was another half of that question.
They were just wondering if you have any tips on identifying, and they have been unable to find any ground nesting bee nests.
Yeah, so it really depends on where you live, right? What kind of habitat types you might be looking for. For us here, we're looking, largely at, ex areas that are ma routinely managed. So, cemeteries, golf courses, trails are really good because really trails are wonderful almost everywhere I go, because they have sort of routine disturbance, um, but doesn't affect the bees that nesting underground. So they like these sort of opened areas.
Great.
And if you're unsure, like, also look at the project and see where bees are nesting in your area, and maybe you can use that as a guide.
And I do see a question here that I think it's important to ask because I believe the answer is going to be important for people to know. Do I need to dig up a nest in order to make an observation?
No. No, make the observation first. So, you're looking for flight activity. Basically, you're looking for bees uh, entering or exiting the ground. Females will be carrying pollen underground. That's a dead giveaway. It's a bee. So just, enjoy the challenge of the photography, and enjoy your, observational skills. If you're unable to really capture the bee with your phone or with a camera, you could just take a photo of this place where it went in and out and say that you observed it but didn't know what it was. And that can be a starting point, and maybe you'll come back and see it again, or maybe somebody else will see what you put on the project and want to try to get a photo of it.
And would you like old observations that maybe don't have all of those details that you mentioned in your what the ideal kind of
Yes.
observation? Would those still be useful?
Yeah, they would be useful, and largely because they will encourage, people to visit those sites again and let us know whether they're still there. I mean, even an observation saying these bees are no longer here. I mean, that would be useful information because we don't know how long bees will utilize a location for yet. So yeah, past observations are a good starting point. It's like, okay, well, let's check and see. Maybe they'll come back and use it again, or maybe they haven't left.
Great point. Thank you, Jordan. Vicky is wondering about the social ground nesting bees that you mentioned. Are these eusocial or true social bees or communal or what specifically?
That's fascinating. I don't know those bees all that well. There was like Geotrigona. I just saw this observation um, on the project, and it was from Brazil. And I just noticed that they did an went to extraordinary lengths to get down to study these bees, and there were multiple cells in the same larger chamber underground. And so I would assume that they were social. Um, but I don't know the specifics for that bee. Probably if it's a trigona, then maybe it's eusocial as well.
Okay, thank you. And this question is also from Vicky. I don't know if you remember exactly which gorgeous turquoise bee you had on at the end of your presentation. I know you've had this great slideshow going for us of all these bees, but are you able to name what that one specifically was?
I'm not sure which bee was being referred to.
I think it might have
Um,
been your last slide of your presentation, or maybe it was one of these on the slideshow. And if so, probably can't
yeah,
remember
the
that
green bees
one.
are halictid bees. They're quite common. So in the US, actually, I have a number of them somehow making it into my kitchen, and I don't know how they did that.
Ah,
So yeah, they're quite visible.
how do bees identify their own nest among the others in the ground?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, so it's not entirely sure worked out, but what bees do when they leave the ground is a good indicator. So they'll do these orientation flights over their nest entrance. They'll sort of weave back and forth over the nest entrance and start mapping it in their mind. Basically, and they're looking, making sort of bigger and bigger sweeps above the ground and taking into account all the landmarks they can. And then they'll just fly off. And when they return, they go whoop right to their spot. So they do this orientation flights and these mappings and programmings, and then they know directly where to go. It's really quite amazing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And you're getting a lot of um, congratulations or just thanks for your wonderful photos and the slideshow that you have going up. So thank you for sharing those with us.
Okay.
Would replacing or planting native plants attract these bees?
So certainly plants play a big role in providing, the nutrients for bees and for allow them to be successful. But it's really important to, sort of take into consideration that they need very specific nesting localities, and we don't yet know what they are. So if we want to really conserve bees in the environment, um, it's imperative that we learn why they nest where they do and learn if we can replicate some of those characteristics and give them additional places to nest, particularly in landscapes that have been heavily perturbed. But I don't think removing plants in particular would make sense Let's focus on figuring out where they are currently nesting and why they're nesting there.
A great point. Thank you, Jordan. And I know that your presentation isn't about wasps, and those are not your specialty, but we've had quite a few folks asking about the difference between ground nesting bees and wasps, and if any of this information would apply to wasps, or are they just a whole different ball game?
Yeah, well, wasps are doing different things in the environment. So, largely wasps are omnivores or predatory, right? So their requirements are often quite different. But, bees and wasps are intermixed phylogenetically, and it's just diet choice that really makes the difference. So it's an interesting question. I imagine that a similar project could learn a lot about what different wasps need in order to nest. For ground nesting wasp, which I'm sure are also probably the dominant strategy for the group. But I did not want to work specifically with wasps because I worry about them and they have treated me poorly in the past. My focus is on the pollen collecting bees.
Sure, sure. Thank you, Jordan. I do want to take a moment to talk about pesticides. You talked about creating nesting habitat, which is one of the peers of Xerces. And so another one of ours is reducing pesticides. And so do you have any thoughts on companies like Mosquito Shield that spray people's yards and how this might affect ground nesting bees?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about that company. I worry about pesticides in the environment, just in general, both from, at home use and also from, commercial use. I just don't think we know enough about how long these chemicals stick around, and really where the impacts, the indirect impacts are occurring also. So I'm pretty hesitant, I don't suggest people to use them. And yeah, it's just the evidence is very clear that they are, a real problem for the diversity of insects, which is the food source for the diversity of almost everything else.
Mhm.
So I think, we should try our best to not use them.
And what about screening for pesticides? Is that practical for someone's property that is across from the road from cornfields or agricultural areas?
You said screening for pesticides?
Hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, there are ways that we can do this. I mean, some of the work that we're hoping to do with these different aggregations, if they're of appropriate size and concern, is to sample some of the pollen provisions from them and screen them for pesticides and just see what they're exposed to, what they're able to tolerate, what they're not able to tolerate. That would be useful information. Again, generally lacking for across the landscape. So, but that study that was looking at countywide use that for pesticides being reported, I mean that goes a long ways to showing um, just how bad they are in the environment in general, even if when they're not directly occurring, locally next to bees.
And everyone can stay tuned for Xerces is we're going to be publishing a paper on some mosquito spraying testing we did with looking at properties that were next to homes that sprayed for mosquitoes, properties where the county was spraying on roadsides near their property, and then people who sprayed their own yards to kind of do a cross comparison. So stay tuned. Hopefully that'll be published later this year.
Okay, we look forward to it. Thank
Great,
you
thank you. Well,
so
I
much.
feel like we've covered some pretty deep topics here, maybe some controversial ones. So I just want to end it with a fun question, which is, do bees use their feet parts or their mouth parts to dig these nests, the ground nesting bees?
Oh my goodness. So I did show you a bit of this bee excavating its nest. They use everything they can, but largely they're using their legs and they'll sort of work the soil back out of the hole and then fling it. And if it's wet enough, they'll see little pieces of mud just shooting off when they're able to really get a hold of it. But yeah, they're backing it all out with these legs. It's amazing the work that they do. to create these house underground. And there's not that many species out there that actually create their own homes. So another reason why bees are remarkable.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jordan, and thank you for sticking around to answer our questions. Some folks do have questions related to maybe your previous research or some things they read in your bio that we posted. Is it all right with you if we give folks your email to reach out to you about questions
Yeah,
you maybe weren't able to answer today?
sure. Yeah. You have the ground nesting bees email, but you can also use the Cornell email.
Okay,
Okay.
awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. You're welcome to reach out to Bee City USA at xerces.org as well with your questions. So thank you so much.
I
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
everyone. Thank you, Jordan, so much.
Bye.